A new patch means it's time to update our difficulty rankings for Season 3. 11.2 launched with a massive overhaul to class design, with a few specs looking very promising for the new season. But who were the biggest winners and losers? Let's find out. And keep in mind that our rankings are all based on skill floors. Think of it this way, a low skill floor is like playing a game with a simple controller. Sure, there might be some ways to min-max, but it doesn't take long to master basic mechanics. On the other hand, a high skill floor is like starting a game with a very complicated controller. It's going to take a bit more time and effort to master the fundamentals. Speaking of which, did you know that the highest rated players are doing almost 25% more damage than the average PvPer? That's like getting a berserker buff in Warsong Gulch. But what's even crazier is that increasing your DPS by at least 10% means you can gain 400 rating on average. As much as these streamers like to brag about crazy mechanics, the fundamentals are what actually matter. For over 10 years, we've helped over 500,000 players turn frustrating losing streaks into consistent wins. Our damage guides are the standard for mastering the perfect rotation on any spec, which is the #1 way to start winning more games, by teaching WoW the right way from your perspective. For as little as $9 a month, you can get instant access to thousands of videos and the #1 UI for PvP, including every setting pre-configured for every class and spec. The best part? We promise to deliver results. If you don't gain at least 400 rating while using our service, you don't pay. So what are you waiting for? Use the discount links below to join the thousands of players in the skill cap community and start climbing today. For now, let's get back to the video. Starting with the melee we think will be the hardest to play in Season 3. For another season in a row, Feral Druid will be one of the hardest melee to play in Arena. In case you missed it, MAME was hit with a small nerf going into this season, having its cooldown increased by 10 seconds. While this might not seem like a big deal, keep in mind that any nerf to CC is also a nerf to everything from win conditions to defensives. Feral also had a relatively complicated rotation based around the archaic system of snapshotting, and will be tough to pick up for the average player. Another spec which we think will remain relatively difficult is Survival Hunter. Even though it got some nice damage buffs in 11.2, the spec is still a bit difficult conceptually, as it is a melee who needs to play like a ranged DPS at times. The patch also placed a greater emphasis on managing tip of the spear stacks. The TLDR here is that there is a lot you will need to do in order to min-max your damage, all while having a lot of external responsibilities and being a very common kill target in most matchups. Finally, rounding out the more difficult melee this patch, we have both Sub and Outlaw Rogue, and let's talk about Sub first since it's typically more popular. For the most part, the spec is relatively unchanged going from Season 2 to Season 3. This season's set bonuses simply offer more burst with the ability to proc Darkest Night earlier in Shadow Dance. Because of this, picking the right target and managing DRs will continue to be even more important this patch. And when it comes to Outlaw Rogue, this spec also hasn't changed much fundamentally. The spec did receive a rework to Killing Spree in 11.2, and on top of getting some damage buffs, we think Outlaw will feel better to play compared to last season. Overall though, this will be a spec that might seem jarring to newer players, as you still have to pay attention to small details, like roll the bones buffs and playing around cooldown reduction. But now let's move away from the sweat and dive into the easiest melee in Season 3. Once again, we will have both warrior specs making the cut, who both got some big damage buffs going into 11.2. Just like always, Fury will continue being the easier pick and is still a great choice for any true beginner to PvP. Even though it can be APM intensive, the Fury rotation is still very straightforward and continues to have a very simple win condition of maximizing uptime, which is fairly easy to do as the Slayer hero spec. Ret Paladin will also continue to be a highly accessible spec for Season 3. And before anyone mentions the fact that it has a ton of utility, we want to remind you of one player, Supatees, who last season did a 0 to hero challenge with Ret Paladin without pressing Blessing of Sanctuary a single time. And if you really wanted to, you could even play a talent that makes Blessing of Sacrifice automatically proc on any target below 35%. So even though the spec might have a lot of utility on paper, it's still very accessible due to its mix of high damage and a solid defensive kit. Finally, the last melee to make it on the easy tier is Havoc Demon Hunter. We know that this has been a relatively polarizing spec over the past few years, but right now DH is just so overtuned that we can't ignore its potential in PvP. Now, we will warn you that Eldrachi Reaver does have a bit of a learning curve, and a huge part of the spec requires you to manage soul fragments well, and at the high level, doing extra defensive things like pre-glimpsing CC will make a huge difference. But outside of this, the raw strength of the Demon Hunter toolkit really carries, especially at lower ratings, and as long as you can maximize damage, you are doing 90% of the work. Every other melee will land somewhere in the middle of these two extremes. Assassination Rogues is still the easiest rogue spec mechanically, and is looking really solid after some big damage buffs going into the patch. Even though the Fate-bound hero spec got some recent nerfs, it's still a really great option, providing mostly passive benefits with the ability to periodically one-shot with some good RNG coin flips. In any case, ever since Garrett and Rupture became AoE, the learning curve for Assassination Rogue dropped considerably, and now it's pretty easy for most players to do big damage on this spec. And speaking of doing big damage, Frost and Unholy will also be making it to the moderate tier. This might seem like a hot take, but these specs more or less have the same playstyle these days. Both Frost and Unholy are entirely centered around doing their massive AoE goes, whether it's through Pillar of Frost or Raised Abomination. In the past, Frost was more hit and run, but these days it has enough sustained damage to stay in the fight. Still, the biggest learning curve for DK will be survivability. You're going to be a popular kill target in Arena as both specs, especially when up against other melee, which means needing to play a bit more evasive when you are waiting for your big AoE goes. Up next is Windwalker Monk, which is yet another spec which barely changed going into 11.2. Just like Frost DK, Windwalker Monk has had a bit of a playstyle shift over the years. It was previously known for its tactician-like hit-and-run playstyle, but these days the spec plays more or less like a Fury Warrior with extra micro CC. The biggest learning curve lately for playing Windwalker Monk is knowing how to manage uptime. There are a few combinations of classes like mages and paladins who can make your life miserable if you're caught being reckless with your mobility. And finally, rounding out the moderate difficulty tier is Enhancement Shaman. Now, we know that the class as a whole does suffer some button bloat, and Enhancement Shaman is no exception, especially when playing the Lava Lash build. But with that in mind, we think Enhancement might actually be easier this season as long as the Tempest hero spec remains meta. This hero tree typically uses the rotationally simpler Stormstrike build, and does some ridiculous one-shot damage. In any case, you will still need to do Shaman things like abusing utility, being disruptive, and so on, which is why we think Enhancement is a perfect fit for moderate difficulty. That brings us to our complete picture of the relative difficulty for Melee in Season 3, with an emphasis on solo shuffle. One thing you might have noticed is that Brawler Melee continue to be on the easier side, and it definitely doesn't hurt that Warriors, Ret Paladins, and Demon Hunters were also big winners when it comes to class tuning this season. But now let's pivot to look at ranged DPS, starting with the hardest specs. We're going to put Shadow Priest in this category, even though it always seems to perform really well at lower ratings. One thing that we will say is that Shadow Priest got a decent quality of life improvement in the patch, as Shadow Crash not only has 2 charges, but has a reduced cooldown. This helps solve one of the biggest problems with the spec, which is getting trained by 2 melee, and at the very least, it will be easier to get dots out more consistently. Other than that, the true learning curve for playing Shadow Priest is knowing how to carve out win conditions. You're the only caster in the game who can cosplay as a sub-rogue, 3-2-1ing CC on the enemy team and setting up kills by yourself with stun silence, and newer players might find this a bit tricky. And even though this might seem like a hot take, we're actually going to put Arcane Mage in the hard tier as well. Even though Arcane has been absolutely broken in the early season, it's still a classic one-spell spec who needs to adopt a very evasive playstyle in order to win, and with the popularity of Hunters, DKs, and Shamans, newer players might struggle to generate meaningful pressure in Arena. As always though, there are a few specs which will continue to have a very low skill floor this season. To no surprise, we have our 2 Hunter specs, with BM definitely being the easier out of the 2. Even though it lost last season's tier set, which made maintaining Barb Shot much easier, BM is still more or less the same spec, but now with slightly more agency thanks to the rework to Mastery, which now buffs the Hunter's damage in addition to the pet. BM also benefited from a buff to Pack Leader, whose signature defensive perk is now much better. Hunters were already quite tanky, especially in solo shuffle, and this was yet another power increase to their passive survivability. As for Marks, we fully expect this spec to retain its classic Noob Slayer identity. Currently, Marks Hunters are doing an absurd amount of damage with explosive shot, aimed shot combos, which we discussed in a recent tier list update. Keep in mind that Marks Hunters are very common kill targets for melee cleaves and solo shuffle, and your biggest learning curve will still be maintaining uptime while under pressure. Outside of Hunters, we still think both Evoker specs will be relatively easy to play in Season 3. In case you've been gone for a while, Devastation has cemented its identity as the melee bully in solo shuffle. Not only does Hover have 2 charges, but also includes a freedom effect thanks to a PvP talent, and can even have its cooldown reset with Deep Breath. This makes Evokers insanely slippery in Arena, and even when melee do connect, your rotation is pretty simple with lots of spell schools to manage interrupts. Between both specs, Augmentation will still be the harder one to play, since you still need to manage all of your utility in between dealing damage. The saving grace is that Augmentation will continue to have insane one-shot potential this season. So if you're into doing crazy burst damage, this spec will be very approachable for beginners. And speaking of doing crazy damage, we still think Elemental Shaman is a great choice for beginners in Season 3. We will talk about this with Resto Shaman later, but the Farseer hero spec lucked out with a crazy 2-set bonus, which simply summons a Giga Ancestor to deal damage every time you press NS. So not only will LE Shamans continue to be one of the lucky casters who doesn't actually need to cast, but now they will have an extra pet to help do instant damage for them. Every other caster will fall somewhere in the middle, so let's break it down. If you've been keeping track, all we have left are 2 mage specs, Warlock and Boomkin. Now, what do you notice here? What do all of these specs have in common? A ton of control. Balanced Druid might seem like an oddball here, and it's yet another spec which is easy on paper, but can be more challenging in practice. The easy part of Balanced Druid is dealing damage. You could get by playing an entire arena game without hardcasting Wrath or Starfire a single time. 90% of your damage will come from instant globals, which can make things easy. But like other casters, the difficult part of Boomkin is getting trained, as you're going to need to be very proficient at kiting and knowing when it's appropriate to shift into bear form. And obviously, you will need some good mechanics, as landing those Cyclones will continue to be crucial this season. Next up, we have Fire and Frost Mage, who both have a spell school advantage over Arcane, which for the most part makes it less punishing to get trained. And even if you're under pressure as either one of these specs, you can still do an absurd amount of damage without ever needing to cast, especially during cooldown windows. The main playstyle difference between Fire and Frost Mage comes down to positioning. For the most part, Fire has retained its classic pace setter playstyle in Season 3 and wants to play more in, capitalizing on combustion to close out games with aggression. Frost Mage, on the other hand, is still a bit of a dampener in solo shuffle, especially after getting some pretty punishing damage nerfs in the early season, but is still super lethal during Icy Veins, which continues to front load a ton of burst. It's hard to say what Warlock spec is the hardest, since they all have a few unique problems and you're going to get trained no matter what. Obviously, Affliction is the most maintenance heavy and not only gets bullied by melee, but also punished by dispels. If you plan on playing Affliction, you really need to work on your mechanics, being proficient at juking and making the most out of those brief precognition windows. Demonology Warlock, on the other hand, is less punished by interrupts, but has to cast the most out of any Warlock spec. It's probably why they moved Master Summoner from the PvP talent slot to the demo tree itself. In order to deal damage as this spec, you need to cast. There's no way getting around it. Finally, Destro is the spec that can get by with casting the least in PvP, but needs to capitalize the most on making use out of brief kill windows. The win condition of Destro Warlock is Chaos Bolt. Full stop. This makes Destro Warlock a bit simple in theory, but if you aren't making use out of your Mortal Coil windows, or if you generate 0 precogs per game, you will struggle as this spec. Anyway, that brings us to our updated difficulty rankings for Ranged DPS in Season 3. Once again, you should notice some trends. Passive tanky specs with damage that is hard to shut down tend to be easier, and specs that rely more on hard casting tend to be a bit more challenging. Now let's wrap things up by looking at the state of healers in 11.2, starting with the most difficult options. Up first is Restoration Druid. Now, we know this spec can be a bit polarizing, especially when it is good, but even last season when it was one of the better healers, it was still struggling hard at lower MMR. Right now, we're noticing similar trends, with Resto Druids having the lowest average rating out of any healer in Solo Shuffle. Now, this could be due to the unpredictable burst damage of the early season, but no matter what damage is looking like, the Resto Druid rotation is still a bit unintuitive for beginners, requiring a lot of proactive play. And it's possible that this season your rotation could become even more difficult thanks to a rework to Implant, which now procs off of Wild Growth, meaning there might be one more button worth pressing in an already bloated rotation. The only other healer we're predicting to be a bit challenging for newer players is Preservation of Ochre. Just like Resto Druid, this is a healer based around proactive play, with the additional learning curve of being the most aggressive healer in the game, having tons of potential when it comes to CC or even dealing damage. One saving grace was a redesign to Nullifying Shroud, which now procs automatically with Verdant Embrace. While this might have been a nerf for more experienced players, it definitely makes Dragons slightly more accessible in Season 3. But now it's time to look at the easier healers in 11.2. Holy Paladin is keeping its title as the most beginner-friendly healer in Season 3, especially after some buffs to Herald of the Sun, which has more of that traditional healer feel. Regardless though, Holy Paladin's got a few quality of life changes in the patch, including a rework to Infusion of Light and more healing baked into Flash of Light. As always, what tends to carry Paladin as a healer is its reactive healing toolkit and abundance of cooldowns, and as long as you can learn the script, you should be set for Season 3. The only other healer that can make the claim of being easy is once again Holy Priest. Just like Paladin, Holy Priest is a very reactive healer and can play very scripted in Solo Shuffle. Rotationally, Holy Priest is also pretty streamlined, being centered around strong instant cast heals, which is looking even better thanks to this season's 2-set, which adds a mini burst heal to Prayer of Mending. Every other healer will land somewhere in the middle this season. Resto Shaman is the perfect example of a moderately difficult healer. On one hand, you have a very simple rotation, being centered around 4 spells for the most part. And thanks to this season's tier set, you will have even more passive healing coming from a Giga Ancestor, which automatically procs from Ancestral Swiftness. At the end of the day though, you are a Resto Shaman, which means having tons of extra responsibilities. We will repeat what we've said in the past. To be a good Shaman requires you to have a lot of map awareness, relying on more than just your healing output to carry the game. Disc Priest is in a similar boat, having some additional damage duties that are impossible to avoid since they help beef up your healing. One learning curve for both Priest specs this season will actually be the Oracle tier set, which will give you more procs of Premonition of Insight. What this means is needing to pay a bit more attention to your rotation every time Premonition is used, making sure to get maximum value from the guaranteed cooldown reduction your tier set now provides. Finally, we have Mistweaver Monk. There's a word we've been overusing lately to describe this spec. The word is polarizing. Not only do monks have some very distinct playstyles these days with the traditional caster, hybrid, or fistweaver builds, but also the contexts where each one of these builds can succeed is also very distinct. On paper, the Fistweaver build should be the easiest, especially after a rework to instant Vivify, but some players might find this playstyle to be completely backwards, as you have to cosplay as a Fury Warrior while being a healer. In any case, monks continue to have one giant problem in Season 3. The problem is mages, and to some degree, dragons and druids too. No matter what spec you play, if you aren't good at avoiding CC, you're going to have a bad time. Anyway, here are the updated difficulty rankings for healers in Season 3. And if you want to rank up fast this season, you need to check out our courses on how to counter every class in PvP. We've also got the best positioning guides on the internet, and our famous class courses which teach you how to master your spec. We take concepts and break them down into bite-sized pieces, kind of like quests, but instead of experience, you gain rating. We've also upgraded our UI in Season 3 with brand new features including in-game bis lists, and now complete 2-in-1 hot swapping between PvP and PvE. As always, we're continuing to offer our Rank Up Guarantee, where we literally promise you will gain rating by using our service. Be sure to click the link below to get started with an exclusive discount for Season 2. For now, we want to thank you all for watching. See you soon.